Welcome to Interviews from Mexico. I'm Laura Carlson, and I'll be your host as we look at cutting-edge issues with the men and women who know them best, here on Telesur. The new NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, which is now called the U.S., Canada, Mexico Agreement, was signed at the 11th hour a few weeks ago, and Canada jumped on board at the very end of the period. Now, Mexico and the United States and Canada will enter a new phase of regional integration, but there's still a lot of questions remaining regarding both the process and what will happen from here on in. It's anticipated that in a very short period of time, the presidents will sign the agreement, and then it has to go through the Congresses of the three countries, where there's still some doubts. But most people are saying they're just glad it's over with, and that it's likely that the agreement will stick. Today, we're going to talk to a representative from Canada, to Gerardo Otero, who's a professor at Simon Fraser University of International Studies, about what the free trade agreement looks like from Canada and what this might mean for Canada-Mexico relations. Gerardo, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thanks, Laura. It's my pleasure.
Well, there was so much talk and almost drama, if you can imagine drama around a free trade agreement, at the end of this negotiations, where Mexico and the United States signed a bilateral, basically, and then Canada got on just before the deadline so that current President Peña Nieto could actually sign the agreement that his team negotiated. How was the end result received in Canada?
I think the main feeling was basically relief, because Canada, like Mexico, is very highly dependent on trade with the United States. So mostly relief.
There's so many aspects there that affect the financial markets, and that whole factor of like having certainty actually comes to take precedence over a lot of the political or more long-term considerations. That's what we saw here in Mexico anyway. Was that the case there?
Yes, I guess the more specific sector that was up in the air in a way is the automobile sector and auto parts, because that's probably the sector that is most tightly integrated in all the three countries. I mean, there are plants in each of the three countries, and final car production has parts from all three countries and from elsewhere as well. So that is the largest chunk of trade, the automobile sector.
Did that seem to work out? What does the industry and consumers as well, because they're affected, what do they think about the final agreement on it?
It seems to me like the automobile representatives were okay with the agreement. I mean, they would have been much happier with not changing anything. But the fact that there was an agreement in itself was a relief, because there was the threat by Donald Trump of slapping a 25% tariff on cars from Canada. Yeah. And so there was a lot of pressure, after the U.S. and Mexico signed their bilateral agreements. The pending threat on Canada was a 25% tariff on cars.
Yeah, there was a lot of arm twisting, which we've come to see as kind of typical of the Trump administration's form of negotiations. Well, here in Mexico, after Mexico signed a bilateral with the United States, with Trump coming out and saying basically, well, Canada can join in or not, we don't really care. We've got our agreement, There was a lot of feeling here, or there was some talk that perhaps Mexico had betrayed Canada at that moment. What do you think about that?
Yeah, well, the reality is that it was the other way around, or there was an attempt by Canada to negotiate a bilateral trade agreement with the United States back in May.
And was that basically going behind the backs of the Mexican negotiators?
Pretty much, yeah.
Oh, really?
So They attempted to do this back in May, and unfortunately for the Canadian team, it didn't work. You know, the Americans didn't agree to the kind of concessions that Canada was prepared to give at that time.
Does anyone know what the sticking point was on that bilateral?
Yes, for Canada, from the very beginning, Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister, said that his red line was Chapter 19, that you know, this trade dispute mechanism between countries, and
that Trump wanted to get rid of.
Yeah, and so what that meant, if it, you know, they got rid of it, is that any disputes would not be settled by these supra-state mechanism, but it would be settled in U.S. courts. Because, I mean, it's a way of, I guess, Donald Trump not wanting to cede any sovereignty at all, even if it's, you know, this business dispute settlement. So, and conversely, for Justin Trudeau, he really wanted to have some protection that Canada was not going to be just at the mercy of U.S. courts.
Of a very erratic president, for one thing. Yeah, and the court system there. So they won on that, but not during the negotiation of what would have been a bilateral. It wasn't until they went back to Mexico and came back to Canada that they were able to kind of work that out.
Yes, and one thing that Canada had to give in on was the three sectors of managed agriculture that Canada has, which are dairy, eggs, and poultry. And I mean, it was a similar concession to the one that had been given before, both in the case of the free trade agreement with the European Union and with the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Oh, so it didn't go much beyond the kind of thing.
It did go a little beyond. I believe for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, it's about 2% of the sectors. And for the U.S., I believe that percentage is going to go up to 6%.
Oh, yeah.
So it's
somewhat more.
Yeah, but you need to take into account the fact that just the state of Wisconsin produces more milk than all of Canada.
Well, that's what I was thinking, Gerardo. You are a specialist in food policy. And so, yeah, well, you just came out with a new book called The Neoliberal Diet that looks at those issues. And so when you see this, it was really, there was an ideological battle there too, which some find surprising because the Trump administration at times defends the rights of governments to have, his own anyway, to have national policies to create better conditions for their own people, and that's basically what the supply management system was for farmers. Do you think that this kind of a resolution, in the long run, did supply management as a concept win? Did it lose? And what could that mean for Mexico?
Yeah, well, I think the supply management concept loses in this particular case. I mean, or at least loses a significant portion, because, you know, once you start giving in on that, maybe that's just the start of the so-called free market forces taking over. And the issue in the United States has always been, at least with regard to dairy, that there's always been overproduction, because the U.S. state has had this very schizophrenic kind of policy of, on the one hand, you know, really supporting and promoting technological innovation, you know, for dairy farmers to produce more and more. But on the other hand, you know, with other hands of the government or government agencies, it tries to control supply. And so in the end, there always is an oversupply. And so the question for the government is what to do with this oversupply. So for many years, I believe a significant portion of dairy has been utilized for handouts, you know, for giving out.
For charity programs.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, like in the cheese products.
Right, the cheese products. And so, but that's you know, not very significant. So
Less and less so.
Yeah, and Canadian prices of dairy products are a little bit above those of the United States.
They have to do with giving a decent floor on to producer prices.
Yeah, from the point of view of farmers, I mean, they've had a very stable system. You know, there's no ups and downs. I mean, that's what a managed supply management system is all about. You know, to keep certain guarantees of prices and income for the stakeholders.
Well, of course, that has not been the situation here in Mexico. They have not had a stable income in many, many farmers, especially the small farmers. And essentially the dairy industry in particular, which is more concentrated in the northern part of the country, has been pretty much wiped out by that situation and has been hurt by that situation. And especially when you figure the concentration of small farmers to like the giant industries like Lala and that kind of thing. Well, if they have a free trade agreement that prohibits nations using those kinds of mechanisms of supply control and baseline producer prices, could that not hurt even further the small farmers in Mexico?
Well, let me just clarify that in northern Mexico, there are actually very few small farmers. Most dairy production, I mean, that's where I come from, you know, from La Laguna, Torreón, Coahuila.
Has that been true for a long time now, even before NAFTA?
It's a very interesting case because, I mean, it was a case that in the late 1950s, there was a cooperative formed, not by small farmers, it was all large capitalist farmers. So Lala took advantage of an opportunity that came up right after the financial crisis. So between 2008 and 2010, they bought several dairy processing firms in the United States, including a co-op, and including the co-op that owns a very traditional brand in the United States, Borden's. And so now they own about 10% of U.S. dairy production.
So again, instead of seeing one nation like wiping out another, or even one nation benefiting of another, what we're seeing is really the transnationalization of production of, in this case, food. You know, that was an interesting issue because Donald Trump always presents these trade agreements as one country taking advantage of another, one country, you know, winning and one country losing. And yet when you actually look at these relations of production, you're finding that not only do they cross national borders, but they're kind of transnationalized on a deeper level. Do you see that in other sectors of, for example, food production?
Well, in food production, I think one of the most noticeable things in Mexico is that there is a tremendous increase in the importation of processed foods on the one hand, and restaurants, you know, chain restaurants from the United States. I was recently at this shopping mall in Monterrey, you know, this wealthy northern Mexican city. And I was looking for some Mexican food. I mean, you know, coming from Canada, I want some Mexican food. I couldn't find any Mexican restaurants in that mall. It was
all U.S. franchises.
All U.S. franchises. I was totally shocked about that.
Not
and
one.
I see this here in Mexico City too, you know, around Perisur. I mean, they're all these U.S. franchises. So that's, you know, comes, you know, to the idea of my book, the neoliberal diet, which is the internationalization or globalization of the US-based or US-originated industrial diet.
Which has led to so much obesity. They claim that it's really probably the primary factor that turned Mexico from, you know, a fairly average country in terms of the rates of obesity, probably low on an international scale, to now one of the countries with the highest rate of obesity in the world.
Yeah, it actually surpassed the United States in 2014.
For all forms of obesity, because it was high in child obesity and then it was...
Yeah, I'm not sure if for all forms, but at least on average,
oh,
yeah.
And the United States has this reputation of of a very high level, and it's related to so many problems like diabetes and
Yeah, heart disease, diabetes, several types of cancer. So there is a very clear, unequivocal relationship between obesity in particular, not necessarily overweight, but obesity, yes, with all these types of health problems.
Well, why do you think that Mexicans were so quick to sacrifice what had been a traditional diet for many people, you know, for generations, if not millennia, and switch to these more processed foods that cause more greasier foods that have led to this epidemic of obesity?
Because one of my main arguments in the book is that a majority of people don't actually have a choice but whatever is on offer. And what's on offer is pretty much determined by these large agribusiness corporations that control the markets.
And there's less local food production, or why has that link been broken between, say, local food production and consumers?
Well,
which could be fresher food.
Yeah, I mean, this is also related to another aspect of the neoliberal diet, which is related to the whole emergence of supermarkets as very important forces in food distribution. I mean, just to give an example, Walmart. Walmart was not even present before 1992 in Mexico. Now, Walmart Mexico, I understand, produces about 20% of its global revenues. So Walmart has expanded dramatically in Mexico, and that has helped to jeopardize regional markets in Mexico. And regional markets were extremely tied to small peasant production. So now...
Because they bought from them, and now a small peasant is not likely to get a contract from a Walmart buyer.
Right, because they prefer to have single large buyers than 2,000, the 2,000 suppliers, right? But the other
More
thing...
industrialized production, which brings with it the problems of agrochemicals too, I imagine.
Right, yeah. No, I think there's also the problem that with the liberalization in Mexico, that started actually before the North American Free Trade Agreement at the end of the 1980s, there was a unilateral opening of agricultural markets. And until that point, Mexico was basically self-sufficient, you know, except for a few peaks in some importations, you know, with some climatic problems or whatever, but...
in food in general.
In food in general, it was mostly self-sufficient. And, but it seems like it was a concerted policy on the part of neoliberal policymakers of liberating a lot of peasant producers so that they would flood the labor markets, and that would play into their whole policy of offering up Mexico as a cheap labor haven for international investors. So that's the connection between
which happened to a large degree, and especially with the free trade agreement, which brings us back to the free trade agreement. Now, this whole conversation has been very closely related to that. The
but let me just finish one thing, that these peasant producers that were all of a sudden made to compete with heavily subsidized US and Canadian farmers, many of them went bankrupt, and so it was more or less irrelevant whether there were regional markets or not, because a lot of the suppliers in those markets were gone. You know, maybe they reappeared in North America in the form of undocumented workers, or documented workers in the case of Canada, because Canada does have about 24,000 Mexican workers in agriculture.
A year?
Yeah, in this federally sponsored seasonal agricultural workers program. And just in British Columbia, there are about 5,000 right now. And there were none before 2004. So this started in 2004 in British Columbia. In Canada, the program started in 1966. Mexico joined in 1974. And it's always been called temporary. but after so many decades, it's really pretty permanent. And that's one of my critiques, to Canadian policymakers, that instead of bringing these workers in a form of unfreedom because they're attached to a single employer, and so they're not free to go to the next door farmer if they're not getting well treated, because that farmer to whom they get attached, they have the right to basically put them on a plane to Mexico the next day, if they complain about anything.
And in part, what is temporary, as I understand it, about this program, is that these people, even though they may have gone up years and years to work in Canada in the harvest, don't really have, or have very limited path to citizenship to
They have
to
no
stay.
path to citizenship at all.
None.
None. Yeah, there's only one temporary workers program with a path to citizenship in Canada, and that is the live-in care workers who come mostly from the Philippines, and this is mostly female workers. After 2 seasons, they can apply for permanent residency. And so what several...
And mostly women, probably. If
Mostly
it's
women,
live-in
yeah. And so what we're demanding, people advocating for Mexican migrants, and I mean, they're also from Guatemala, for instance, and from the Caribbean, to give them permanent residency on arrival, because only in that way would they have more or less conditions, to unionize, for instance.
Full labor rights.
Full labor rights, yeah.
Well, again, what's remarkable about the new free trade agreement, which is not that different from the old free trade agreement, is this key issue of labor and migration is not included at all. And it's such a hugely important, not just social factor, because we've seen what happens when it's not included and it just goes into criminalization and security areas, in the United States especially, but it's also such an important economic factor. We don't have time, I'm glad it came up in this sense, but unfortunately we don't have time to go into it, although we should definitely do it on another program. Gerardo, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you.
And thank you. We'll be back next week on Interviews from Mexico.
Our action